What if one decision could change everything? Meet Alexander Wright, a millionaire who thought he could buy his future, and Emily Carter, a homeless artist whose life would be forever altered by an unexpected offer. This is their story of power, love, and the price of a legacy. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more twists and turns. You won't want to miss this one. The soft hum of the city lights outside Alexander Wright's penthouse contrasted sharply with the suffocating silence within. Alexander stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the glittering skyline of Riverview City. To anyone else, his life would seem perfect, a tech tycoon worth billions, owner of an empire that had revolutionized the way the world communicated. But for all his wealth, there was one thing he couldn't escape: the emptiness. At 42, Alexander had long since stopped believing in the fairy tale of love. His first marriage ended with mutual bitterness, while the second dissolved under the weight of his obsession with work. Both times, he had walked away more convinced than ever that emotions were liabilities. Love was fleeting, unpredictable, a distraction. Yet despite his cynicism, the need for an heir gnawed at him. He couldn't leave his empire untended, at the mercy of distant relatives or corporate sharks. The idea had come to him weeks ago, sparked during a meeting with his legal advisor. A surrogacy arrangement, they had called it, but the traditional route felt too tangled, too many variables, too much involvement. No, what Alexander wanted was simple. Someone who could carry his child, free from emotional complications or future entanglements. A clear contract, devoid of sentimentality. It was, he told himself, the most rational solution. That evening, Alexander called his assistant, Clara, into his office. Clara had worked for him for nearly a decade, her efficiency and discretion unmatched. She was one of the few people he trusted implicitly. "I need you to handle something for me," he began, his tone brisk, almost clinical. "It's personal." Clara raised an eyebrow, her pen poised over her notebook. "Of course. What do you need?" "I'm looking for someone to carry my child." The words hung in the air, as stark and cold as the winter wind outside. Under strict contractual terms. No involvement beyond the agreement. "I want this done discreetly." Clara's expression didn't waver, though the request was far from ordinary. "I'll make the arrangements," she said, jotting down a note. "Do you have any preferences?" "No," Alexander replied curtly. "Just someone suitable." As Clara left the room, Alexander leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had expected the decision to feel like a resolution, a step toward filling the void. Instead, it felt hollow. Weeks passed, and though Clara presented him with profiles of potential candidates, none seemed right. Most were polished, prepared, too rehearsed, too calculated. What Alexander sought wasn't perfection, but practicality. He wanted someone real, someone who understood struggle, yet had the resilience to endure. Someone who would comply with the terms without unnecessary complications. One cold evening, as he drove through the dimly lit streets of Riverview City, he spotted her. At first, she was just another figure in the shadows, a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, her back against a brick wall. But as he slowed his car, his eyes caught the motion of her hands, sketching furiously on a scrap of paper. Despite her ragged clothes and the grime of the street, her expression was one of fierce concentration, as if the chaos around her didn't exist. Alexander found himself inexplicably intrigued. It wasn't pity. He had no patience for that. But something about her determination, her refusal to succumb to her circumstances, struck a chord. For a moment, he hesitated, his rational mind warning him against impulsivity. Yet, as he drove past, he found himself circling back. Pulling up beside her, he rolled down the window. "Excuse me," he called out. The woman looked up, startled, her blue eyes piercing even in the dim light. She clutched her sketch pad tightly, as if shielding it from the world. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone defensive but not hostile. Alexander hesitated. This wasn't how he had envisioned this conversation. "I have an opportunity," he said carefully. "One that could change your circumstances." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Alexander replied, his voice firm. "It's a business proposition. If you're interested, meet me tomorrow. The Riverview Grand Penthouse Suite." He handed her a card with the address, then drove off before she could respond. As the car sped through the night, Alexander's thoughts churned. He didn't know why he had chosen her or what had driven him to approach her in such an uncharacteristically impulsive way. All he knew was that, for the first time in months, something felt right. Back on the sidewalk, Emily Carter stared at the card in her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly from the cold, but her mind raced. What kind of man drove up to a homeless woman in the dead of night with a mysterious proposition? She had every reason to dismiss him as another rich eccentric. Yet something about his tone, his demeanor, had piqued her curiosity. Tucking the card into her pocket, Emily returned to her sketching, though her focus was now elsewhere. For the first time in years, the faintest glimmer of possibility flickered in her mind. And so, the wheels of fate began to turn. The Riverview Grand was nothing like anything Emily Carter had ever seen in her life. Towering above the city like a monument to wealth and power, its sleek glass exterior gleamed in the morning light. Emily stood at the entrance, clutching her worn sketch pad tightly. Her fingers twitched with anxiety, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. This was her chance, a chance at something, though she didn't yet know what. Her night had been restless. She'd spent hours debating whether to show up. A part of her screamed to avoid the man entirely. Nothing good ever came from the promises of strangers. But desperation had a way of silencing doubts. Winter was settling in, and her options were running thin. If this opportunity was real, she couldn't afford to let it slip away. A doorman eyed her skeptically as she approached, her frayed coat and scuffed boots a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the hotel's clientele. Emily hesitated but pushed forward, mumbling Alexander Wright's name. The doorman's demeanor shifted instantly at the mention, and he directed her to the private elevator. As the elevator ascended, her heart raced. She could hear the faint hum of classical music piped through the speakers, a luxury she found oddly unsettling. When the doors opened, she stepped into a sprawling penthouse that took her breath away. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Riverview City, the skyline stretching endlessly before her. Alexander Wright stood by the window, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as she entered, his sharp features unreadable. Today he was dressed in a tailored navy suit, the picture of control and precision. "You came," he said, his tone neutral but faintly approving. "I'm not sure why," Emily admitted, shifting awkwardly. "I don't even know what this is about." Alexander gestured toward the sleek leather sofa. "Please sit. I'll explain everything." Emily hesitated, then complied, perching on the edge of the sofa as if ready to bolt. Alexander sat across from her, his gaze steady. "My name is Alexander Wright," he began, though he didn't elaborate. His name was already well known, even to someone like Emily who had no place in his world. "I'll be direct. I'm looking for someone to carry my child." The words hung in the air, as stark and shocking as the pristine white walls around them. Emily blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice laced with incredulity. "I want an heir," Alexander continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "But I have no interest in marriage or traditional family arrangements. I need someone who can fulfill this role under specific terms." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. Of all the things she had expected, this was nowhere on the list. You want me to have your child?" "Yes," Alexander said bluntly. "In exchange, you'll be compensated generously. Enough to change your life." Emily's first instinct was to laugh. It sounded absurd, like something out of a movie. But the seriousness in Alexander's expression wiped the humor from her mind. He wasn't joking. This was real. "Why me?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "You could pick anyone. Why some random girl on the street?" "Because you're resilient," Alexander said simply. "You've survived circumstances most people wouldn't. That kind of strength matters. And, frankly, I don't want someone who's polished or rehearsed. I want someone real." His words cut through her doubt, striking a nerve. Resilient. Strong. For years, Emily had struggled to hold onto those pieces of herself, even as the world tried to strip them away. But this was something else entirely. "What's the catch?" she demanded. "There's always a catch." Alexander leaned back slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. The arrangement is strictly contractual. No emotional involvement. You'll carry the child, give birth, and walk away with financial security. The child will be mine, legally and in every other way. Emily's stomach twisted. The offer was both tempting and terrifying. She thought of the cold nights on the street, the hunger gnawing at her, the endless struggle to make it through each day. This could change everything. But at what cost? I don't know, she said, her voice wavering. This is a lot. I understand, Alexander said. Take some time to think about it. But know this, opportunities like this don't come often. He slid a folder across the glass coffee table. The details are in here. Read it over. If you decide to proceed, call Clara. Her number's inside. Emily picked up the folder, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. She stood, her legs shaky. I'll think about it, she murmured. Alexander nodded, standing as well. Good. Take your time. But don't wait too long. As Emily left the penthouse, her mind swirled with a mix of emotions, fear, doubt, and a flicker of hope. The folder in her hands felt like Pandora's box, holding both salvation and ruin. That night, as she sat in her usual corner of the park, Emily opened the folder. The terms were as stark and clinical as Alexander himself. A generous financial sum, medical care, housing, everything she could ever need. In return, she would have to give up the child, relinquishing all rights. She closed the folder, staring up at the night sky. Could she do this? Could she trade 9 months of her life and a piece of her soul for the chance to escape the cycle of poverty? For the first time in years, Emily prayed for clarity. Whatever decision she made, it would change her life forever. The next day, Emily found herself standing in front of the Riverview Grand once again. This time, the nerves in her stomach were almost paralyzing. She clutched the folder tightly, the contents now etched in her memory. She had spent the entire night weighing her options, caught between the undeniable allure of stability and the cold, clinical nature of the agreement. Her decision wasn't made lightly, but desperation had its own voice, a louder, more persuasive one. Clara greeted her at the penthouse door, her professional demeanor sharp but not unkind. Mr. Wright is expecting you. Please follow me. The walk through the penthouse felt longer than it should have. Emily's eyes darted to the extravagant decor, the sleek marble floors, the priceless art pieces adorning the walls, the understated elegance of a life lived far beyond her imagination. She couldn't help but feel out of place, a ragged puzzle piece in an otherwise flawless picture. When they reached the expansive office, Alexander was seated behind a mahogany desk, reviewing documents. He looked up as they entered, his sharp gaze assessing her with the same intensity she remembered from their first meeting. You've decided, he said, more a statement than a question. Emily took a deep breath. I'll do it, but I have questions. Alexander gestured to the chair across from him. Of course. Sit. Emily sat, placing the folder on the desk. Her fingers tightened around the armrests, steadying herself. This contract, it's thorough, but it's cold. What happens after the baby is born? I'm just supposed to walk away? That's correct, Alexander replied evenly. Once the child is born, your part of the agreement is fulfilled. You'll receive the full payment, and there will be no further involvement. And if I change my mind? She asked hesitantly. Alexander's expression hardened slightly, though he didn't raise his voice. This arrangement only works with clarity and commitment. That's why the contract is explicit. If you sign, there's no room for uncertainty. Emily's stomach churned, but she nodded. Okay, what about during the pregnancy? Will I have any say in anything? You'll have the best care available, Alexander assured her. Doctors, nutritionists, anything you need for a safe and healthy pregnancy. However, decisions regarding the child's welfare will ultimately be mine. His words felt final, leaving no room for negotiation. Emily knew this wasn't a partnership. It was a transaction. And yet, she couldn't ignore the numbers at the bottom of the contract. That money could erase years of struggle, give her a chance to start over, maybe even pursue the dreams she'd abandoned long ago. Clara handed her a pen, her face neutral. Take your time, she said softly, as if sensing Emily's hesitation. Emily stared at the document in front of her. Each clause felt like another chain wrapping around her, binding her to a life she couldn't fully comprehend. But the alternative, going back to the streets, scraping by day after day, felt even heavier. Her hand trembled as she signed her name. The moment the pen lifted from the paper, it was as though a weight shifted from her chest to her shoulders. She had made her choice, but the consequences of it loomed like a shadow. Alexander stood, extending a hand. "Welcome to your new life, Miss Carter." Emily shook his hand, her grip firm despite the unease coursing through her. "Thank you, I guess." "There's no need for gratitude," Alexander replied, his tone as measured as ever. "This is a mutually beneficial arrangement." Clara stepped forward with a tablet in hand. "We'll arrange for your relocation immediately. A car will take you to the estate this afternoon. You'll have a room prepared, and your initial medical appointments are already scheduled." "Wait," Emily said, blinking. "This afternoon?" Just like that. Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "There's no reason to delay. The sooner we begin, the better." Emily felt a pang of anxiety. She hadn't expected things to move so quickly, but there was no turning back now. She nodded, standing. "All right, I'll be ready." That afternoon, Emily sat in the back seat of a sleek black car, her belongings reduced to a single worn backpack. As the city skyline faded behind her, she felt a strange mix of dread and hope. The driver was silent, the soft hum of the engine the only sound as they wound through the countryside. When they arrived at the estate, Emily's breath caught. The mansion was enormous, surrounded by sprawling gardens and high, wrought-iron gates. It looked like something out of a storybook, beautiful but unwelcoming. The grandeur only served to remind her how far she was from her old life. The housekeeper, a kind-faced woman named Margaret, greeted her at the door. "Welcome, Miss Carter. I'll show you to your room." Emily followed Margaret through the endless hallways, her eyes darting to the lavish furnishings. Every detail seemed meticulously designed, but it all felt cold, as if the house itself mirrored Alexander's detached personality. Her room was more like a suite, complete with a king-size bed, a private bathroom, and a balcony overlooking the gardens. It was the most luxurious space she had ever seen, yet it felt suffocating in its perfection. "This is mine?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret smiled kindly. "Yes, dear. If you need anything, just let me know." After Margaret left, Emily sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the soft fabric of the comforter. She glanced at the contract she had brought with her, now folded neatly on the nightstand. The reality of her decision was sinking in, heavier with each passing moment. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. Emily walked out onto the balcony, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The estate was silent, save for the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in years, she wasn't worrying about where she would sleep or when she would eat. Yet, the sense of security came with a cost she couldn't yet quantify. She stared out at the horizon, her thoughts swirling. The contract had been signed, the wheels set in motion. There was no turning back now. For better or worse, Emily Carter's life had changed forever. Emily woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The unfamiliar softness of the bed and the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the gauzy curtains didn't match the cold park benches or the cramped shelter she was used to. Then reality settled in. She was no longer homeless. She was here, living in a mansion, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, because she had agreed to one of the most unorthodox decisions of her life. As she stepped out of bed, her feet sinking into the plush carpet, Emily felt a twinge of unease. Everything about the estate felt surreal, like she had wandered onto the set of a movie. The air itself seemed heavier here, weighted with the expectations and rules she would soon have to navigate. The first day passed in a whirlwind of introductions and logistics. Margaret, the housekeeper, showed her around the sprawling estate. There was the grand dining hall with its crystal chandelier, a library filled with books Emily doubted anyone had read, and a sunroom with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in golden light. The property stretched for acres, with manicured gardens, a shimmering pool, and even a private pond. But as beautiful as it all was, Emily couldn't shake the coldness of the place. The staff were polite but distant, their smiles practiced and professional. She saw little of Alexander, who seemed content to keep their interactions to a minimum. Instead, Clara, his efficient and no-nonsense assistant, handled everything. "We'll begin your medical appointments tomorrow," Clara said, handing Emily a detailed schedule over lunch. The meals, served by a chef, were delicious but felt oddly impersonal, like everything else in this house. "You'll have a personal nutritionist, and we'll monitor your health closely throughout the pregnancy." Emily nodded, overwhelmed by the sheer level of organization. "And what do I do in the meantime?" Clara tilted her head slightly, as though the question puzzled her. "You're free to do as you like. Relax, explore the grounds, pursue hobbies if you have any. Your well-being is our top priority." Relax. The word felt foreign to Emily. For years, her life had been a constant fight for survival. Now, she was being told to rest, to enjoy herself. But how could she, when the terms of her stay felt like invisible walls pressing in on her? The days turned into a strange routine. Emily met with doctors and specialists who treated her with a level of care she wasn't used to. They ran tests, discussed her diet, and reassured her that everything would be meticulously managed. She found herself both grateful for the attention and unnerved by it. When she wasn't at appointments, Emily spent hours wandering the estate. She discovered hidden corners of the garden where wildflowers grew untamed, offering a brief reprieve from the mansion's perfection. She sketched whenever she could, using the high-quality art supplies Alexander had provided without comment. One afternoon, while exploring the library, she found a small alcove tucked away behind rows of towering bookshelves. A single window let in a stream of light, and a plush armchair sat waiting as if it had been placed there just for her. It became her refuge, a place where she could forget, even briefly, the strange circumstances of her new life. But even in moments of peace, Emily couldn't escape the transactional nature of her arrangement. The mansion, for all its beauty, felt like a gilded cage. The staff were courteous but distant, and Alexander himself remained a shadowy figure in the background. One evening, as Emily sketched in the sunroom, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Alexander standing in the doorway. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, but his tie was slightly loosened, and there was a faint weariness in his eyes. "I see you've made yourself comfortable," he said, his voice as even as ever. Emily set down her pencil. "Trying to," she replied honestly. Alexander's gaze flicked to her sketchpad. "You're talented," he remarked, surprising her. "Have you always drawn?" "For as long as I can remember," Emily said. She hesitated, then added, "It's one of the few things that's been constant in my life." Alexander nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. "If you need anything, you only have to ask," he said before turning to leave. "Why me?" Emily blurted out, the question escaping before she could stop it. Alexander paused, his back still to her. "I told you before. Strength matters." "It still doesn't make sense," she said, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You could have chosen anyone, someone better suited for this." Finally, he turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think you're not suited for this?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "This isn't exactly something I ever imagined doing." "Neither did I," Alexander said quietly. For a moment, something almost vulnerable flickered in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "But here we are." With that, he left, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. Over time, Emily began to notice subtle changes in her surroundings. Alexander's presence, though infrequent, became slightly less detached. He started asking questions, not just about the pregnancy, but about her. What she liked, what she needed, how she was adjusting. At first, Emily didn't know how to respond. The man who had seemed so cold and unapproachable was showing glimpses of something human. She didn't trust it, not entirely, but it made her wonder if there was more to him than the calculated businessman she had agreed to work with. Still, the mansion remained a lonely place. Emily found herself longing for conversation, for connection. She began chatting more with Margaret, who shared stories about her years working for the right family. Clara, though brisk and professional, softened slightly when Emily asked about her background. The staff, Emily realized, weren't as robotic as they first seemed. They were simply used to keeping their distance, a habit formed from years of working for a man who valued boundaries above all else. As weeks turned into months, Emily started to settle into her new reality. The mansion still felt cold, but she found warmth in small moments. Margaret bringing her tea on chilly afternoons, Clara's rare but genuine smiles, the vibrant sunsets she watched from the garden. But even as she adapted, the weight of the contract lingered. She couldn't forget why she was here or what would happen when the pregnancy was over. The mansion, the care, the fleeting moments of connection, they were temporary. And when the time came, she would have to walk away, leaving behind not just the child, but this strange, complicated world she had come to inhabit. For now, though, Emily focused on one day at a time. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it with the same resilience that had brought her here. Weeks had passed since Emily arrived at the estate, and while the days had settled into a quiet rhythm, the undercurrent of tension remained. The mansion, with its cold grandeur, still felt like a place she was just visiting, not a home. But amid the sterile perfection of her new life, there were small moments that began to carve out a space for something unexpected, a connection, fragile but real. One afternoon, as the late summer sun filtered through the high windows of the sunroom, Emily was sketching the view of the sprawling gardens. The sketchbook, a gift from Alexander, had become her constant companion. The pages were slowly filling with drawings of the estate's serene beauty, but her hand still itched to draw the streets she used to roam, her past life that felt so far away now. Yet, in these drawings, there was something she couldn't escape, the yearning to capture a feeling, not just a scene. As she shaded in a patch of trees near the edge of the property, a soft voice interrupted her focus. "You're getting good at that." Alexander's voice was more casual than usual, though there was still the same guarded quality to it. Emily looked up, startled. She hadn't noticed him enter. He stood by the door, hands in his pockets, his usual stiff posture relaxed for once. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he continued, stepping into the room. His gaze flicked to her sketchpad. "You're capturing the light well. There's a certain softness to it." Emily hesitated. Compliments from him still felt like foreign currency, rare and hard to spend. But for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself smiling, a small but genuine smile. "Thanks," she said, her voice tentative. "It's not what I usually do, but it's kind of soothing." Alexander nodded, as if processing her words carefully. "Art can do that. It's the one thing that doesn't require calculation." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And you're good at calculating everything, aren't you?" The challenge in her tone was immediate. She couldn't help herself. Being around Alexander had begun to spark something in her, a need to understand the man who seemed as if he were built from nothing but logic and precision, someone who could never fully be known. For a moment, Alexander's expression remained unreadable, but then a small, almost imperceptible smile played at the corner of his lips. "I suppose I am," he replied, his voice softening. "It's how I've survived, I suppose." That was the most personal thing he'd ever said to her, and Emily could feel the subtle shift in the air between them. There was a sudden vulnerability in his words, an openness that contradicted the steely, controlled persona he wore so well. Emily didn't know how to react. "Well, you seem to have everything calculated," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "But are you happy?" The question lingered in the space between them, unexpected and unguarded. For the first time since their arrival at the estate, Alexander seemed taken aback. He blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question, and for a moment, the mask of indifference slipped just enough to let something else show. A flicker of doubt, a crack in the impenetrable armor he'd built around himself. "I don't know," he replied quietly, his gaze drifting to the window, as if the question had stirred something deep within him. "I suppose I've never really thought about it." Emily watched him for a long moment, surprised by the shift in the conversation. This wasn't the man who had coldly handed her a contract and offered her money for a child. No, this was someone else, someone who, just for a brief moment, seemed like a person. Not an invincible tech billionaire, but just a man, struggling with the same question she had lived with for years. She didn't know what to say next. Her usual response to awkward silence was to retreat, to stay behind the walls she'd built for herself. But something about the way Alexander spoke, the vulnerability that had slipped through, compelled her to stay. Before either of them could say anything further, Clara appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Wright, we need to discuss the next phase of Emily's medical checkups," she said, her tone businesslike. Alexander's expression hardened once again, and the brief moment of connection between them vanished as quickly as it had come. "Of course," he said, stepping back. "We'll talk later, Ms. Carter." Emily nodded, a quiet disappointment settling in her chest. She knew this was his way of retreating into what was familiar, into the calculated businessman she had come to know. But for a second, she had seen something else, something raw. In the following days, Alexander and Emily continued their routine of polite distance. He stayed mostly out of her way, leaving her to her appointments and her time in the estate's vast gardens. But something had shifted in Emily. She found herself looking for the quiet moments when Alexander might let down his guard again, when the man behind the cold exterior might reveal himself. She also found herself thinking more and more about their contract. What had seemed so clear-cut before, the deal, the lack of emotion, had started to feel more complicated. She hadn't expected to care, but somehow, over the past few weeks, she had begun to question everything. Could she walk away when the time came? Could she really leave the children, her children, behind and walk out the door, as if nothing had changed? The questions gnawed at her late at night, when the estate was quiet and she was left with nothing but her thoughts. What was it that had brought her here? Really? Was it simply the money, or had something else shifted in her? The feeling that, maybe, she could build a life here, a life she hadn't expected? The next week, while Emily was sketching by the garden pond, she saw Alexander again, this time without the cold distance he usually maintained. He was walking towards her, not with the formality of a business meeting, but with a slower, more deliberate pace. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something like curiosity in his expression. "I was wondering," he began, his voice softer than usual, "if you'd like some company while you work?" Emily looked up from her sketch pad, startled. She hadn't expected him to seek her out, not for anything personal. "Company?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes. I've been told that some of the best ideas come from collaboration," he said with a half-smile. "Collaboration?" she repeated, amused. "You're offering to help me with my sketching?" Alexander shrugged slightly, looking almost sheepish. "I could try, but if nothing else, I'd like to hear more about your art. I think I'm starting to understand it." Emily couldn't help but laugh, a soft, surprised laugh. The offer, though unexpected, felt sincere in a way that made her heart skip. The walls between them were still high, but here, in this moment, there was a crack in the facade. "I'd like that," she said, feeling a strange warmth spread through her. As he sat down beside her, Emily realized that maybe this, whatever it was, could be the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated. In the most unexpected way, they were beginning to find a connection. The weeks slipped by in a quiet blur. The routine of Emily's life had become a strange dance of adjustment. Medical appointments, nutrition check-ins, and endless days spent either exploring the estate or sketching in solitude. She had learned to navigate the grand halls of the mansion, to accept the polite but distant nature of the staff, and even to tolerate the carefully constructed silence between herself and Alexander. There were moments when she wondered if she would ever feel truly at ease here, but she had learned to make do with the little comfort the estate offered. The house was stunning, no doubt, but it was also a prison of its own design. Despite the coldness, there was something else beginning to form between her and Alexander. She couldn't put her finger on it, but every now and then she would catch him looking at her with a certain softness in his eyes. It wasn't the calculated gaze of a businessman, nor the cold detachment of the man who had struck the deal with her. This look was something different, something that felt almost human. It made her wonder if perhaps there was more to him than he let on, if he, too, was struggling with something he didn't know how to express. One morning, Emily was sitting in the library, her sketchbook open, but her pencil frozen in midair. The stillness of the room, the quiet rustle of the leaves outside the tall windows. It was almost peaceful. Almost. But today, there was an unusual weight in the air. Something had shifted, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Her hand moved almost instinctively, filling in the rough outline of the mansion's tower with light shading, when the door to the library creaked open. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Good morning," Alexander said, his voice softer than usual, almost tentative. Emily glanced up, surprised by the change in his tone. Normally, his words were clipped, controlled. This was different, almost as if he had entered with a different intent, one that wasn't purely business. "Morning," she replied, setting her pencil down. She hadn't seen him in a few days, and she had started to wonder if he was purposely keeping his distance. "I was wondering if you'd mind joining me for a checkup today," Alexander said, leaning against the doorframe. I thought it might be a good idea for us to go together." Emily blinked, confused. "A checkup?" she asked. "Yes," he said, his gaze flickering to the open medical folder in her hand. "Your next routine appointment. I thought I'd come with you." She stared at him, not sure how to interpret this invitation. She had assumed the medical staff handled everything while Alexander focused on his work. But now, he was offering to join her? She didn't know whether to be suspicious or touched. "I wasn't expecting you to come with me," she said slowly. "I thought it might be good for both of us," he replied, his eyes steady. "We're in this together now, whether we want to admit it or not." The words stung more than she expected. Together. She couldn't help but repeat it, tasting it. It was strange to hear him say it aloud, even if it was still wrapped in the context of a business deal. But there was something in the way he said it that made her wonder if the distance between them was starting to narrow. After a brief silence, she nodded. "Okay, I'll be ready in a few minutes." The ride to the medical facility was silent, save for the soft hum of the car's engine. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, trying to make sense of the strange emotions swirling inside her. Alexander, ever the controlled figure, sat beside her, eyes fixed on the road ahead. But there was something different about him today. His posture wasn't rigid as usual. His jaw wasn't set in that familiar expression of calculated determination. He seemed almost uncertain. They arrived at the clinic in silence, and Alexander escorted her inside. The doctor greeted them both with a professional smile, but Emily noticed the way his eyes flicked briefly to Alexander before turning to her. It was the same look she had seen from many people in the past, some combination of curiosity and uncertainty when they saw a man like Alexander right standing beside someone like her. The appointment was routine. Blood pressure, glucose levels, basic vitals. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as the doctor performed the ultrasound, Emily's heart began to race. This wasn't just another checkup. This was the moment when everything would become real. As the technician moved the ultrasound wand over her stomach, Emily stared at the screen, watching the gray shapes flicker on the monitor. She couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and anxiety. What would it feel like to see her child? To know that this was her future, in a way she hadn't expected? "Everything looks good," the doctor said, offering a reassuring smile. "But let's take a closer look." The technician adjusted the settings, and the screen shifted. Emily's breath caught as the clear image of a tiny, wriggling form appeared. She could barely make out the features, but the small heartbeat, strong and steady, filled the room with a sound that both amazed and terrified her. "Twins," the doctor said, his voice calm, but with a note of surprise. "It looks like you're expecting twins." The words hung in the air for a long moment, their meaning settling in Emily's chest. She had expected one child, not two. But twins? The shock hit her like a wave, and she glanced quickly at Alexander. His face was a mask of controlled surprise. His eyes flickered between the screen and Emily's face, as if processing what the doctor had just said. "Twins?" Emily whispered, feeling her heart race. "Yes," the doctor said, nodding. "It's rare, but it happens." Alexander looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Well, this changes things." Emily's mind spun. Two babies. She had known this wouldn't be simple, but twins? She had no idea what to expect now. For a brief moment, she saw Alexander's usual composure crack. His jaw tightened, and there was an unmistakable flicker of something. an emotion that wasn't controlled or calculated. Was it fear? Excitement? She couldn't tell. But whatever it was new, and it changed everything. As they left the clinic, the air between them was charged with a new energy. Emily's thoughts were racing, and she could feel the weight of Alexander's silence beside her. Neither of them spoke for the entire drive back. The twins. Emily's mind kept returning to the ultrasound image, to the small, beating hearts she had just seen. She was carrying two lives inside her, two futures that were inexplicably tied to her own. And now, she couldn't help but wonder how this news would affect her life at the mansion, her relationship with Alexander, and the contract she had so casually signed in the beginning. The complexity of it all felt overwhelming. Two children, a future she hadn't planned for, a man who seemed to have it all figured out, but was now facing an uncertainty of his own. When they returned to the mansion, Alexander didn't immediately leave. He stood in the foyer, looking at Emily with something akin to contemplation. "I'll leave you to process this," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "But we'll need to discuss the next steps. Twins changes everything." Emily nodded, unable to find the words to respond. She needed time to digest the news, to understand what this meant for her future, and for her increasingly complicated relationship with the man who had, in his own way, become part of her life. As Alexander left her standing there, she felt the enormity of what was ahead. The contract was still there, still looming over her, but now the reality of the situation was even more complicated. Two children, and a man who was no longer just a businessman in her eyes, but someone who, like her, was beginning to face the unknown. The days that followed were a strange mixture of routine and uncertainty. Emily spent much of her time in the solitude of the mansion, trying to process the news of the twins. Two babies. The weight of it all sat heavily on her chest as she grappled with the reality of the situation. She had signed up for a deal, a contract, cold and clinical. But now, with the unexpected news of twins, the dynamics were shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her body was changing rapidly, her stomach expanding, her energy waning as the pregnancy progressed. She found herself more fatigued, more fragile, as if the weight of the new lives inside her was pulling her in different directions. Alexander, too, seemed to be adjusting to the news in his own way. He was still distant, but there were moments, small ones, when he showed a different side of himself. It was as if the mere existence of the twins, his children, was forcing him to confront emotions he had long buried under the weight of his power and ambition. One evening, Emily was sitting on the grand porch, the sun sinking low behind the mansion, casting a golden glow over the grounds. Her sketchbook lay open in her lap, but she wasn't drawing. She couldn't concentrate. Her mind was too full of thoughts about her children, about the life she was building in this strange house, and about Alexander, who, despite everything, seemed to be slowly entering her world in ways she couldn't explain. It was then that he appeared, as silently as he always did, stepping out from the shadows of the mansion and onto the porch. His presence was familiar by now, though still unnerving in its quiet intensity. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Emily looked up, surprised by the question. Normally, Alexander would simply take charge of the situation, as if it were an unspoken rule. But this time, there was a vulnerability in his tone that made her hesitate. She nodded, pushing a chair out slightly, offering him space. He sat down across from her, but for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Emily couldn't help but study him. The way his face was slightly drawn, his jaw tight, as if he was battling with something deep within himself. His usually pristine appearance seemed slightly disheveled, as if the weight of the past few days had started to take its toll on him. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice almost hesitant, a stark contrast to the commanding tone he usually used. "About the babies, and about us." Emily raised an eyebrow, her heart racing. The way he said "us" made her pause. Was this another one of his cold, calculated observations? Or was there something more beneath it? "I thought I could just," he paused, rubbing the back of his neck, as though struggling for words. "I thought I could do this on my own, keep everything separate. The baby, the contract, the arrangement. But I didn't realize how complicated it would get. With twins, You're not used to things being complicated, are you? Emily interrupted, her tone almost playful, though she couldn't hide the slight bitterness beneath it. She had spent enough time with Alexander to know that he preferred control above all else. And the idea that he was now grappling with a situation that was beyond his mastery was, in a way, ironic. Alexander met her gaze, a flicker of something passing between them. Something raw, something real. No, I'm not used to it, but it's different now. I'm not used to feeling uncertain. The words hung in the air, and Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. Alexander Wright, this man who had built an empire on control and precision, was admitting to uncertainty, to fear? She had never expected this, never imagined that someone so seemingly invincible could experience such vulnerability. "You're afraid?" she asked, her voice softer now, more genuine than before. "Not afraid," he replied, his voice firm once more, "but uncertain. I've always had a plan, always known what comes next. But with this," he gestured toward her stomach, where the twins were growing steadily. "I don't have a plan. I don't know what I'm doing." Emily didn't know what to say. It was strange hearing him admit this, and yet it was oddly comforting. For so long, he had seemed like a man who lived in a world of absolutes, a world where nothing was left to chance. But now, it was clear that the arrival of the twins had shaken something deep within him. "What do you want, Alexander?" she asked, her voice suddenly small and certain. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "I want to make sure they're safe, that they grow up with everything they need. I want to be a father to them. I want to make sure I'm not making the same mistakes I made with my own family." There was an unfamiliar honesty in his words, a rawness that cut through the layers of armor he had built around himself. For the first time, Emily saw him not as the powerful, emotionally detached businessman, but as a man struggling with his own sense of inadequacy. "I don't know how to do this," he continued, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I've never done anything like this before." Emily's heart softened. In that moment, she saw him for who he really was, just a man trying to navigate a world that was no longer as simple as it once seemed. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Alexander looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time since they had met, he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "I don't want to do it alone," he admitted, "but I don't know how to ask for help." "You don't have to ask," Emily said, her voice steady. "You're already doing it, by being here, by being honest." For a moment, there was silence between them, and in that silence, something shifted, something small but significant, a crack in the wall that had separated them. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a beginning. "I'm still not sure how this is all going to turn out," Alexander said, his voice low again. "But maybe we can figure it out together. One step at a time." Emily didn't know if he meant the twins, or their relationship, or something else entirely. But in that moment, she realized that she, too, had begun to hope. The days that followed were filled with quiet, subtle changes. Emily found Alexander joining her at meals more often, engaging in casual conversations that felt oddly personal for someone who had once kept his distance. He began asking about her well-being, checking in with her more frequently, and offering assistance when it came to the mundane details of her life at the mansion. It was as if a slow shift was taking place, one neither of them could completely explain. And in this strange new dynamic, Emily found herself torn between caution and curiosity. Could she trust him? Could she allow herself to believe that this was more than just a shift in circumstance? Could she allow him into her world, into her heart? For now, she didn't have the answers. But for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, she felt a glimmer of hope. That perhaps, in this complex, messy, and unexpected journey, they could find something that neither of them had ever anticipated. The air in the mansion had changed in the weeks leading up to Emily's labor. The space that had once felt cold and sterile now hummed with a quiet tension, like the calm before a storm. Emily's pregnancy had progressed rapidly, and her body was showing the strains of carrying twins. But despite the discomforts and the unpredictability of it all, there was a strange sense of calm settling within her. She wasn't sure whether it was the quiet acceptance of her new reality or the growing bond she felt with the two tiny lives inside her, but something had shifted. Alexander had been different too. The man who once existed behind a wall of power and control now showed signs of vulnerability she had never expected. He was there for her in ways he hadn't been before, attending medical checkups, asking how she was feeling, and even taking time out of his day to check on her when he could. It was still tentative, still marked with a kind of uncertainty, but it was real, and she found herself, perhaps foolishly, beginning to trust him. And then, the day arrived. It came in the middle of the night, just as the last of the autumn leaves fluttered to the ground outside. Emily had been restless, tossing and turning, the heaviness of the twins pressing down on her. She had felt the first signs of labor, the discomfort turning into something sharper, something that made her breath hitch and her heart race. But it wasn't until she felt the first wave of intense pain that she knew this was it. The babies were coming. Panic shot through her. It felt too soon. She wasn't ready. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed the number she never thought she'd need. The sound of the phone ringing echoed in the silence of the mansion, and Emily's breath quickened as she pressed it to her ear. "Alexander," she gasped, her voice strained with the first of many contractions. "It's time." There was no hesitation on the other end. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice calm but urgent. She could hear him moving quickly, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the phone. Moments later, she heard him on the other side of the door, his knock urgent but controlled. "Emily, it's me." She couldn't speak past the pain, the waves crashing over her with each contraction. "Come in." The door opened, and Alexander stepped into the room, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something more human, something raw. His eyes, usually so focused and sharp, were wide with concern. He moved quickly to her side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We need to get you to the hospital," he said, his voice steady, though she could hear the tension in it. She nodded weakly, not trusting her own voice to answer. The pain was intensifying, and everything inside her screamed to be anywhere but here. But there was no time to waste. Alexander helped her to her feet, supporting her with surprising tenderness. They moved quickly through the mansion, his hand never leaving her side as they reached the car. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity, each moment stretching out longer than the last. Through the pain, Emily found herself clinging to the idea that, despite everything, she was not alone. The hospital was chaotic when they arrived, but Alexander made sure they were ushered straight to the delivery room. The staff, though busy, knew who he was, and everything was quickly arranged. The room was sterile, cold, but it wasn't the surroundings that concerned Emily. It was the overwhelming reality that soon she would be a mother. Hours passed in what felt like minutes, the pain coming in waves that left her gasping for air. Alexander never left her side, his presence a constant, steadying force. He was there when the nurses instructed her to push, his hand gripping hers tightly as she bore down through each contraction. When the first cry filled the room, Emily felt her heart lurch in her chest. It was loud, desperate, and full of life. Her baby, one of her babies, was here, but as the seconds ticked by, something was different. A second cry, softer, but just as strong, and it hit Emily with a force she didn't expect. Twin cries. She had known they were coming, but hearing both of them together, was something else entirely. Alexander's face was unreadable as the doctor handed him the first of their children. A baby boy, small and fragile, but with a strength that matched the cries he had made moments earlier. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she watched Alexander hold their son. His face, usually so stoic, softened in a way she hadn't seen before. It was a fleeting look, one that passed as quickly as it had come. But it was enough. Enough for her to see that the man who had once seen everything as a transaction was now a father. Then, the nurse brought her daughter. The twin girl was just as small, just as fragile, but there was something about her that made Emily's heart swell. She reached out, taking the tiny girl into her arms, her breath catching as she looked down at the perfect little face staring back at her. Alexander stepped back, watching the two of them. His gaze flicked from Emily to the twins, then back again, as if trying to process everything that had just happened. He cleared his throat, and for a moment his voice caught in his chest. "I never thought it would be like this," he admitted, his tone raw, unguarded. "I never thought I'd feel this. I thought I could control everything, but these two—" His voice trailed off as he looked at the babies, his eyes filled with something deeper than he had ever shown before. "They've changed everything." Emily smiled softly, the exhaustion beginning to settle into her bones as she cradled their daughter. "Maybe that's the point," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Maybe we weren't supposed to control everything." For the first time, Alexander nodded in agreement. It wasn't a grand realization. It was quiet, small, but it was enough. They had made it, together, and now they had to figure out what came next. As Emily lay there, cradling her children, Alexander stood by her side. The air was different now, calmer, more peaceful. For the first time in a long time, Alexander didn't feel the need to control the world around him. He was a father now, and that, more than anything else, was the one thing he couldn't plan for. But somehow it felt right. It felt like everything had finally fallen into place. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly, deeply human. And it was in that moment that he realized he wasn't alone anymore. Not in this. Not in anything. The first few days after the twins' birth felt like a dream. A surreal, beautiful whirlwind of emotions that Emily struggled to fully comprehend. The hospital was quiet, and the sterile, white walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Nurses came and went, checking on her, making sure the babies were healthy and strong. And Alexander, though quiet and reserved as usual, had shown a side of himself that Emily had never expected. He was gentle, patient, and always by her side. He held the twins with surprising tenderness, his face softening every time he looked at them. There were moments when he would catch Emily's gaze, and in those moments, she saw something in his eyes, a spark of emotion, one he had kept buried for years. But despite the quiet joy of those early moments, there was an underlying tension, one that had been growing since the moment she signed the contract. The twins were here, and with them came a reality that neither she nor Alexander had truly prepared for. The agreement they had made, the one that had seemed so cold and businesslike, was still very much in place. Emily had given birth to the children, fulfilling her end of the contract. But the terms had always been clear. Once the twins were born, she was to leave. The arrangement had been about securing a legacy for Alexander, a way to pass on his wealth and power. It had never been about family or love or anything more than what had been written in those cold legal terms. The thought of leaving them, of leaving the twins, tore at her heart in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every time she looked at their tiny faces, every time she heard their soft cries, a part of her felt a deep, aching pull. They were hers, and yet they weren't. They had been given to her to carry, but in the end, they would belong to Alexander. The reality of it all weighed heavily on her as she lay in the hospital bed, staring down at the twins. They were sleeping now, their little bodies nestled close to each other, their tiny hands curled in fists. Emily's heart swelled with love, but that love was tangled with a bitter sense of loss. The contract was clear, and she had known from the start that there was no room for attachment. But she hadn't expected to fall in love with them. She hadn't expected to feel this deep, unconditional love that pulled her heart in all directions. As the days passed, the thought of leaving became more and more unbearable. She wasn't just leaving Alexander's mansion or the life she had come to know. She was leaving her children, the babies she had carried for 9 months, the babies who had been a part of her. It wasn't supposed to feel this way. The day they were discharged from the hospital, Emily struggled to keep her emotions in check. Alexander had arranged for a private car to take them back to the mansion, and when they arrived, everything felt the same as it had before. Cold, impersonal, a monument to a life she didn't fully understand. The sprawling estate loomed ahead, its imposing walls standing as a constant reminder of the deal she had made. But it was the children that weighed most heavily on her heart. She had hoped, foolishly, that maybe things would change, that Alexander might see the twins as more than a legacy to carry on his name. But in the quiet moments of those first few days back in the mansion, it became clear that nothing had changed. Alexander was still the same man, emotionally distant, detached. The walls he had built around himself hadn't cracked completely, and he hadn't yet come to terms with the gravity of fatherhood. He was doing what he felt was necessary, taking care of the twins, arranging for their future, but it was still all so clinical, so calculated. And Emily? Emily was torn. She knew she had to leave. The contract had been made, and it had been clear from the start that she was never meant to be a permanent part of their lives. But now, after everything, the birth of the twins, the tenderness in Alexander's gaze, the fragile bond they had begun to form, it felt impossible. The thought of walking away from the twins, of abandoning them to a life that would be filled with more privilege than love, felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. Her days were filled with the overwhelming tasks of caring for newborns. Feeding, changing, soothing. But every time the twins looked up at her, their innocent eyes filled with trust, her heart shattered just a little more. They were so young, so small. They needed her. And yet, the contract loomed over everything, like a shadow she couldn't escape. One evening, as she sat in the nursery, holding one of the babies as they drifted off to sleep, Alexander appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask of composure. But his eyes, they were different. There was something in them, something that spoke of uncertainty and confusion. "Emily," he said quietly, stepping into the room, his gaze flicking to the baby in her arms. "We need to talk." She nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. "I know," she whispered, not daring to meet his gaze. He took a step forward, his voice soft but firm. "The contract, Emily, it was clear. You agreed to leave once the twins were born." She swallowed hard, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I know what I agreed to, Alexander. I know the terms." Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly regained control. "But I can't leave them. I can't leave my babies." His jaw clenched, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. He paced a few steps, his mind clearly turning over what she had said. Then, to her surprise, he spoke again, his voice quieter now, more uncertain. "Emily, I don't want you to go," he said, his voice breaking slightly as he looked at her, at the baby in her arms. I never thought it would be like this. I never thought I would feel this way." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "But the contract, we can't just ignore it." The pain in his voice was unmistakable. And for the first time, Emily realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The man standing in front of her, the man who had once been so cold and calculating, was struggling just as much as she was. Alexander didn't want her to leave, but he didn't know how to break free of the agreement that had once seemed so necessary. Her heart ached with the realization. She had come into his life as a transaction, as a means to an end, but somewhere along the way, it had become something more. And now, both of them were caught in the web of their own making. But there was a way out. "Alexander," she said softly, meeting his gaze for the first time, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You don't have to keep me here because of the contract. You don't have to follow through with it. We can change things. We can make a new plan, a real one." For a long moment, he said nothing, and Emily wasn't sure if he was going to push back, to remind her of the contract that had started it all. But when he finally spoke, his voice was laced with something different, something softer. "Emily," he whispered, his eyes searching hers, "tear up the contract. Stay. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Stay as a part of this family." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The walls they had both built had cracked, and now it was up to them to rebuild. And for the first time, Emily felt something she hadn't felt since the moment she arrived in Alexander's life. A glimmer of hope. The decision to tear up the contract had been both freeing and terrifying. For the first time since their unusual agreement began, Alexander's actions reflected something more than cold calculation, something raw and human. He had asked her to stay, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper that neither of them had anticipated. And for Emily, it was a lifeline, a chance to build a life, however fragile, with the children she had carried and the man who had once treated her like a mere pawn in a game of legacy. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new routines and quiet shifts. Emily moved into a smaller wing of the mansion, where the twins' nursery was set up. It was a modest space compared to the rest of the house, but it was warm and filled with light, a refuge from the overwhelming sterility of the larger estate. The walls here were painted in soft, calming tones, and the room was filled with the smell of fresh flowers, an unexpected touch from Alexander, who had been busy overseeing the rest of the mansion's operation while Emily adjusted. At first, things felt awkward. Alexander kept his distance during the day, absorbed in work as he always had been. But at night, when the house grew quiet and the babies needed tending, he would appear at the nursery door, hesitant at first, but slowly finding his place. He helped with the feedings, rocking the babies to sleep when Emily's arms grew tired, his gaze softening as he looked down at the tiny lives they had created together. There were moments, fleeting but real, when Emily could see the father he was becoming, his guarded exterior unraveling little by little. They began to talk more, though at first it was about logistics, about the twins' schedules, the caretakers, and the mundane details of their daily lives. But with each conversation, Emily found herself learning more about him, and perhaps more surprisingly, he began to share pieces of himself with her. His childhood, lonely, filled with expectations he had never been able to meet. His failed marriages, cold, transactional relationships that left him questioning whether he was capable of love. Each story revealed a man who had buried his emotions deep beneath layers of ambition and power, someone who had convinced himself that success was all that mattered. But now, those walls were crumbling, and Emily was watching it happen slowly, day by day. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily found herself speaking more freely than she had ever expected to. "You know," she began, her voice thoughtful, "I never expected you to be like this. I thought you were, well, distant. But the way you've been with the twins, how you care for them, it's different." Alexander glanced at her, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite place. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "I never thought I would be this way either," he said quietly. "But I've realized that for all my success, there's always been something missing. I've spent so much time building my empire, but I never thought about what truly mattered. What? Who was worth fighting for?" Emily looked at him in surprise, her heart skipping a beat. His words were honest, unguarded, and for the first time, she saw the depth of the man sitting across from her. He wasn't just the billionaire tycoon. He was a man who had suffered, who had fought against the world and, in doing so, had shut out the very things that made life worth living. She nodded, her voice soft. "It's strange, isn't it? How life can take us down paths we never imagined. How things can change in ways we never thought possible." He met her gaze, his eyes intense. "You've changed things for me, Emily," he said. "I never thought I could care for anyone, let alone be a father. But these twins, they've opened something inside me. And I think I'm starting to understand what it means to love, to be vulnerable." The words hung in the air, both heavy and delicate. Emily could feel the shift between them, the unspoken understanding that had taken root. She had come into his life under the most unlikely of circumstances, but somehow they had found each other against all odds. And now they were navigating this uncharted territory together, one step at a time. But while their relationship was evolving, Emily knew that there was still much to be done. The remnants of the contract, of their initial arrangement, still lingered between them. It was there in the way Alexander's eyes sometimes hardened when he focused too long on business. It was there in the way Emily sometimes caught herself wondering if she was truly welcome or simply tolerated out of a sense of obligation. There were times when she would catch herself questioning their future, if this newfound bond could withstand the complexities of their pasts. She had signed a contract that had been clear from the start. Her role was never meant to be permanent. And Alexander, despite the changes in him, was a man who valued control above all else. He had built his life on it. Could this fragile relationship truly survive the weight of all that had come before? One night, As the twins slept soundly in their cribs, Alexander and Emily sat in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the background. She looked at him, her thoughts swirling, before speaking up. "Do you ever wonder if we're just fooling ourselves?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she continued, "we've changed. I can see it in you. I've changed too. But everything that brought us together, it was based on a contract, on something cold, something that had nothing to do with love. Do you think it's enough? Can we really build something real on that?" For a moment, Alexander was silent. His gaze drifted to the fire, his fingers brushing over the rim of his glass. And then, slowly, he spoke. "I don't know, Emily, but what I do know is that I don't want to go back to what it was before. I don't want to be the man I was, the man who built walls to keep everyone out. I don't want to let that version of myself define who I am anymore." Emily held her breath, her heart racing in her chest. This was the moment. This was the choice they both had to make. Could they build something real together? Or would they remain two strangers bound by a past neither of them could fully escape? As she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Uncertainty, yes, but also a glimmer of hope. "I don't have all the answers," Alexander said softly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But I'm willing to try, Emily. For us. For the twins. For something that's real." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Emily believed him. This wasn't just about a contract anymore. It was about them, about the family they were becoming slowly but surely. "I'm willing to try, too," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision. "I want to build something real with you, Alexander." And in that moment, as the fire crackled softly between them, they both knew that whatever came next, they were no longer bound by a contract. They were bound by something deeper. Trust. And maybe, just maybe, a love that had been waiting to bloom all along. The weeks that followed Alexander's declaration were filled with moments of quiet transformation. Emily had come to realize that the foundation they were building, though fragile, was strong enough to stand against the weight of their pasts. Their bond, once forged out of necessity, had begun to shift into something genuine. The twins, of course, were the center of it all, the little lives that had brought them together and kept them tethered to one another in ways neither of them could have predicted. But now, it was no longer just about the twins. It was about them, too, the man and the woman who had once been strangers, now learning to live as a family. Despite the emotional journey they had shared, Emily remained cautious. She could see the changes in Alexander, the moments when his hard exterior cracked, when he let himself care, when he seemed vulnerable. But there were still days when the man she had first met, the one who had been driven by control and ambition, would resurface. He would retreat into himself, buried beneath the demands of his business empire, losing himself in work. But every time he reappeared at the nursery or sat beside her at dinner, she was reminded that their relationship had evolved. It was no longer just about him providing for them. It was about the partnership they were building together. One evening, as winter began to settle in, casting a soft chill over the estate, Alexander invited Emily to join him in the garden. The world outside was quiet, blanketed in snow, and the air was crisp with the promise of the season's change. The mansion, with its tall stone walls and imposing presence, seemed distant, almost ethereal, in the moonlight. They stood together in the center of the garden, the snow beneath their feet glistening like diamonds. "I thought we could take a walk," Alexander said, his voice warm despite the cold air. He extended his arm to her, an invitation, and Emily hesitated for only a moment before slipping her hand into the crook of his arm. As they walked in silence, the crunch of the snow beneath their feet the only sound, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settling over her. She had never imagined her life would take this turn, never thought she'd be standing here, arm in arm with a man who had once been her employer, her benefactor, now her partner in a way she hadn't expected. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of love yet, but somehow it felt right. She felt seen. She felt valued. Alexander led her to a small gazebo tucked in the far corner of the garden. The structure was delicate, covered in ivy that had been trimmed back for the winter, and its open sides allowed a panoramic view of the estate. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the snow. "I've been thinking," Alexander began, his voice low but clear, "about everything that's changed, about everything we've gone through. And I realize that I've spent so much of my life focused on building an empire, on creating something that would outlast me. But now, I'm starting to understand that real legacies aren't just about wealth or influence. They're about the people we leave behind, the relationships we build. And Emily, you and the twins, you've become my legacy in a way I never expected." Emily's heart skipped a beat as she turned to face him. His words were vulnerable, raw, and they struck a chord deep within her. She had never heard him speak this way before. It wasn't the controlled, calculating man she had first met. It was a man who had come to understand the true meaning of family, of love, and of what it meant to leave something behind that mattered. "I'm not the man I was when we first met," Alexander continued, his gaze meeting hers. "I don't know if I can ever undo all the things I've done or change all the mistakes I've made, but I know this. I want to build a future with you, with the twins. I want to be the father they deserve, the partner you deserve." Emily felt a rush of emotions flood through her, a whirlwind of disbelief, hope, and something even deeper. She had spent so long thinking she was merely a means to an end in Alexander's life, an instrument for him to create the legacy he desired. But now, standing here with him, hearing the sincerity in his voice, she realized that she wasn't just a part of his legacy. She was part of his future. "I want that too," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to build something real. I want to be here with you for the rest of our lives. But you have to know that I'm not just here because of the twins or the contract. I'm here because I want to be with you. I'm here because I believe in us." Alexander's lips quirked into a faint smile, and he stepped closer to her. The space between them seemed to vanish as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily's breath caught in her throat as he opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. Her heart raced as she looked up at him, the significance of the moment washing over her. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "will you marry me? Not because we have a contract, not because it's what's expected, but because I want to build a life with you. Because I want to make a promise to you and to our family that I will be here, not just as a father, not just as a partner, but as someone who loves you, who wants to spend the rest of my life with you." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she looked at the ring, at the man who had once seemed so unreachable, now standing before her, vulnerable and open. She had never imagined this moment, never thought it would come. But here it was real and undeniable. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, I will marry you." Alexander's face lit up, the tension that had gripped him dissolving in an instant. He gently took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger, and as he did, it felt like a new chapter was beginning for both of them, one they were ready to face together. In that moment, under the moonlit sky, surrounded by the quiet of the world, Alexander and Emily knew that they had both changed. They had grown together, stumbled and healed together, and now they were ready to face the future, hand in hand, with love and trust at the core of everything they had built. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Wright believed in something greater than ambition. He believed in the love he had found, the family they had created, and the future they would build together. A future that would be his true legacy. The wedding was an intimate affair, a quiet celebration of love and commitment that took place within the walls of their sprawling estate. It was a far cry from the lavish, grandiose ceremonies that Alexander had once envisioned for himself, but somehow, this smaller gathering felt more meaningful. The mansion, with its towering walls and sprawling gardens, was no longer a symbol of cold ambition or isolation. It had transformed into the backdrop for a new life. A life built not on control or legacy, but on love and mutual respect. Emily stood by Alexander's side as they exchanged vows, the twins cradled in the arms of close family friends who had come to share in their joy. The ceremony was simple, but every word spoken was filled with truth. every glance exchanged between them full of promise. Emily had never imagined her life would lead her here, but now, as she looked at Alexander, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, a feeling of belonging that had eluded her for so long. The life she had once known, the one marked by uncertainty and survival, now seemed like a distant memory. In its place was something warmer, something richer. As the ceremony concluded and they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, Emily realized just how far they had come. From the cold contract that had initially bound them, to this moment of heartfelt connection, their journey together had been anything but conventional. Yet, it had been theirs. It had been real. The days that followed their wedding were filled with new routines. Alexander, who had once been all about his business empire, now found himself balancing work with family life in ways he had never expected. He was no longer the man who buried himself in meetings and conference calls. Now, he was the father who played with the twins on the floor, the husband who joined Emily in the kitchen to cook dinner, the man who found joy in the quiet moments of life rather than the rush of success. He had never realized just how much he had been missing until he had it all: the love, the laughter, the chaos of family life. For the first time in his life, Alexander Wright understood that success wasn't measured by wealth or power. It was measured by the people you loved, the people who loved you in return, and the life you created together. Emily, too, had found a sense of fulfillment she had never known. After years of living on the margins, struggling to survive, she had found a place where she was valued, not just for what she could give, but for who she was. She continued to pursue her art, her creative outlet that had once been her only refuge. Now, she had the support of Alexander and the warmth of her family, allowing her to thrive in ways she never imagined. The twins were her greatest inspiration, their laughter and curious eyes fueling her creativity as she painted and sketched, capturing the beauty of the world around them. The months passed quickly, the seasons changing as they did. The twins, Lily and Max, grew stronger and more curious with each passing day. They had become the heartbeat of the household, their laughter filling every room, their small hands clutching at everything they could reach, exploring their world with a sense of wonder. Alexander, who had once believed that the pursuit of his own ambitions was all that mattered, now found that nothing compared to the joy of watching his children grow, their first words, their first steps, and their endless questions about the world around them. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, watching the sun set behind the hills, Emily turned to Alexander, her heart full. The twins were nestled in their stroller, fast asleep after a long day of playing, and the quiet evening air was filled with the sounds of nature. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice soft, almost as if she was afraid to disturb the peace they had found. Alexander looked at her, his gaze steady, and for a moment he said nothing. His thoughts seemed to drift back to the man he had once been, the man who had built his empire on his own, who had thought that money and power could solve all his problems. That man, now a distant memory, had been replaced by someone who understood that the true measure of success was not what you had, but who you shared it with. "Yes," he finally said, his voice filled with sincerity. "For the first time in my life, I truly am." He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently as he looked down at their sleeping children. A sense of contentment washed over him, a feeling that he had spent so many years trying to find. It wasn't the feeling of conquering the world or achieving his goals. It was the quiet joy of family, of knowing that he was no longer alone. He had a partner in Emily, someone who saw him for who he truly was, not the persona he had built around himself. And in the twins, he had found a love that was pure, unconditional, and unbreakable. In that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the garden, Alexander realized that he had everything he had ever wanted, not in terms of wealth or success, but in terms of love, family, and happiness. His legacy, he now understood, wasn't about the empire he had built. It was about the family they had created together. It was about the love they shared, the life they had built, and the future they would continue to shape, side by side. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice full of emotion. "For everything." Alexander smiled, his heart full as he leaned in to kiss her gently on the forehead. "No," he said softly. "Thank you for showing me what truly matters." And as they sat together, the stars beginning to twinkle above them, they knew that this was just the beginning of their new life. A life built on trust, on love, and on the promise that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together, united as a family. Years had passed since Alexander and Emily's wedding, and their lives had unfolded in ways neither of them could have predicted. The mansion, once cold and distant, had become a warm home, filled with laughter, love, and the sounds of their growing family. The twins, Lily and Max, were now young children, their boundless energy and curiosity continuing to inspire the world around them. Alexander, who had once sought to build a legacy of wealth and power, now found his greatest joy in the moments they shared as a family, moments that were fleeting, yet infinitely precious. Alexander's empire had flourished, but it no longer consumed him. He had learned to balance work with life, prioritizing the love he had found in Emily and their children. He had grown as a person, no longer just the ambitious tycoon he once was, but a devoted husband, a present father, and a man who knew that true success was measured not by how much he had, but by how much love he gave and received. Emily, too, had flourished in ways she never imagined. Her art had evolved, and with Alexander's unwavering support, she had held several exhibitions, each one more successful than the last. But it was her role as a mother and wife that had truly fulfilled her. The woman who had once struggled on the streets had now created a life she had never dreamed of, one where she was cherished, supported, and seen. She had learned that her worth wasn't defined by her past, but by the love and strength she brought to her family. Together, they had created something lasting, not just the empire that Alexander had built, but a family, a home, and a love that transcended everything they had once known. As they sat together in the garden one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, Emily smiled at Alexander, her hand resting in his. The twins were playing nearby, their innocent laughter filling the air, and for the first time in his life, Alexander felt complete. He had everything he had ever wanted and more. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Emily asked, her voice filled with wonder. Alexander looked at her, his heart full, and shook his head with a smile. "Every day. But what matters most, Emily, is that we're here now, together, and that's all I need." They sat in the quiet comfort of each other's presence, the weight of the years they had shared grounding them in the present, as they looked ahead to the future they would continue to build together. Their legacy, after all, was not in the things they had accumulated or the milestones they had achieved. It was in the love they had found, the family they had created, and the life they had built together, a legacy that would live on in their hearts, in their children, and in the generations to come. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander and Emily knew that their journey was far from over. It had only just begun. Thank you so much for following along and listening to the entire story. I hope you enjoyed every moment and felt the emotions it brought. If you liked the story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any exciting videos in the future. Feel free to share this video with your friends and family so they can enjoy it too. Thank you once again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next story.